Hey guys, tonight we slip barefoot into a kitchen that no longer exists, where the floor is cool packed earth, the air is thick with smoke and steam, and somewhere behind you a pot murmurs like it's alive. You are standing in a West African royal kitchen centuries ago, long before recipe blogs, before written menus, before anyone thought to document vegetables unless they were taxable. Palm oil lamps throw lazy light across calabash bowls, and the smell isn't one thing. It's leaf green bitterness, damp soil, ash, and something faintly sweet that you can't quite name because that plant no longer grows here. You inhale it anyway, because you can, and because you probably won't survive this kitchen if you start coughing like a tourist. This is not the tidy Instagram version of history. This is heat on your skin, grit between your toes, and cooks who know exactly how long a leaf can boil before it turns from medicine into mush. Somewhere outside these walls, kingdoms rise and fall. But in here, power is chopped, crushed, and simmered. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what the local time is. Midnight in Lagos? Dawn in Delhi? Somewhere in between, half asleep and pretending tomorrow doesn't exist? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move closer to the hearth. A cook, anonymous, because history rarely bothered to save her name, lifts a bundle of leaves you don't recognize. They're broad, slightly fuzzy, and smell like rain hitting hot stone. She knows exactly how to handle them. Too much heat and they turn bitter. Too little and they stay tough, like chewing on rope. This knowledge is not written anywhere. It lives in hands, passed down like a secret. Here's a mainstream fact to ground you before your mind drifts too far. In pre-colonial West African kingdoms, food production and cooking were central to political stability. Rulers were judged not just by war or trade, but by whether their households, and by extension, their people, ate well. Kitchens were infrastructure. Starving subjects were dangerous subjects. So vegetables mattered, even if chroniclers later pretended they didn't. But notice what's missing. There are no tomatoes here, no chili peppers yet, no maize. Those arrived later, riding the wake of transatlantic ships. Right now, the greens in this pot are indigenous, domesticated slowly over generations, adapted to erratic rains and stubborn soils. Many of them will vanish quietly in the centuries to come, replaced by crops that yield faster, travel better, or please foreign palates. You watch as the leaves are pounded with a wooden pestle, fibers breaking down under steady rhythm. This isn't about speed, it's about coaxing flavor and nutrients out of something wild enough to resist being eaten. Some of these vegetables are semi-domesticated at best, plants pulled from forest edges, tolerated in gardens, encouraged but never fully controlled. Historians still argue whether certain greens were deliberately cultivated or simply managed wild foods, hovering in that gray zone between foraging and farming. The pot bubbles, the smell changes, earth becomes broth. This is where power becomes edible. A quirky detail slips in as you stand there half asleep. Some palace kitchens kept specific bitter leaf dishes reserved for rulers during illness or ritual periods. Because bitterness was associated with cleansing and restraint. Sweet foods were indulgence. Bitter foods were discipline. Imagine modern politicians forced onto a diet of aggressively bitter greens during scandals. History missed a trick there. You lean against a wall and realize how little of this survives on the page. Arab geographers wrote about gold and armies. European traders obsessed over spices, ivory, people. Vegetables, barely worth ink. If a plant didn't travel well or generate profit, it disappeared from the record. That silence is why you're here, listening to a kitchen instead of a throne room. The cook skims foam from the pot. She tastes, nods, adjusts. This is precision without measurement. Another fact anchors you. Oral culinary knowledge in West Africa often followed strict apprenticeship systems. You didn't just pick up cooking. You trained, sometimes for years, especially in elite households. That training included knowing which vegetables were safe, which were seasonal, and which could kill you if prepared wrong. Because yes, some edible greens walk a thin line between nourishment and poison. Fun dinner party trivia if your dinner parties involve survival. You feel the heat, steady and relentless. Firewood choices matter. Some woods smoke too much, overpowering delicate leaves. Others burn clean and hot. Everything here is intentional. And yet, centuries later, these vegetables will be labeled lost, as if they wandered off on their own. They didn't. They were pushed out by climate shifts, by colonial agriculture policies, by the slow creep of imported crops that promised higher yields and lower effort. There's an uncomfortable thought you can't quite shake. Loss doesn't always come from disaster. Sometimes it comes from convenience. The pot is lifted. The dish is finished. Somewhere beyond this kitchen, a ruler eats. Decisions are made. Histories unfold. The vegetable you just watched being cooked will not get a name in the archives. It will not be illustrated. It will survive only as a memory. A taste someone tries to describe to a grandchild decades later, starting with, "It was a leaf, kind of like..." No, not like that. As you drift with that thought, remember this feeling, the heat, the smoke, the quiet competence of hands that know exactly what they're doing. Because once this kitchen fades, it doesn't come back easily. And this is only the first room you've stepped into tonight. You don't leave the kitchen so much as drift outward from it, following the path the vegetables themselves once took. Outside the palace walls, the air opens up. You feel sun instead of fire, dust instead of ash, and the low murmur of people doing what humans have always done best, trading food while arguing about its value. You are standing in a market long before any empire stamps its name onto the land, before borders harden, before anyone calls this West Africa as if it were a single thing. The stalls are temporary, woven mats, overturned baskets, piles of leaves kept damp with morning dew. These are not luxury goods. These are survival. Women squat beside heaps of greens, roots, and pods, some cultivated close to home, others gathered from forest margins and riverbanks. Farming here is mixed, flexible, and deeply intelligent. Fields are not endless monocultures, they are mosaics. Sorghum beside legumes, yams near shade trees, leafy vegetables tucked wherever there's space and moisture. Here's a solid historical anchor before your thoughts wander. Long before large, centralized kingdoms, West African societies practiced complex agroecological systems, including intercropping and shifting cultivation. These methods protected soil fertility and ensured dietary diversity. Vegetables weren't an afterthought, they were nutritional insurance. If grains failed, leaves could still feed you. If drought came, hardy greens might survive where nothing else did. You pick up a bundle of leaves at one stall. The seller tells you, patiently because you clearly look confused, that this one grows fast after rains but hates too much sun. Another thrives in poor soil but needs pounding to soften it. This knowledge isn't casual. It's economic power. Knowing which vegetable grows where and when means you eat while others go hungry. That's leverage, even if no one calls it that yet. There's a faint irony here that history will later ignore. These early markets are diverse because they need to be. No single crop dominates. Variety is resilience. And yet, centuries later, the narrative will praise staple crops as markers of civilization, quietly sidelining the vegetables that made survival possible in the first place. You move through the crowd. Some plants have names you'll still hear echoes of today. Others are already slipping into obscurity, known only locally, their names changing village by village. Linguists love this stuff. Historians, less so. Historians still argue whether certain vegetable names found in oral epics refer to specific species or entire categories of edible greens, because translation flattens nuance like a pestle flattening leaves. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you pause near a trader who refuses to sell you a particular leaf. "Not today," she says. "It's not ready." In some regions, vegetables were bound by seasonal taboos, eaten only at certain times, often tied to fertility rituals or ancestral calendars. Eating them out of time wasn't just unhealthy, it was disrespectful. Imagine telling someone they can't eat spinach because the ancestors said no this month. And yet, people listened. You start to see how vegetables move not just through soil, but through belief. A plant that feeds you during lean months might be celebrated. One associated with famine might be quietly despised later, even if it saved lives. This emotional baggage matters. It shapes what people choose to grow when they have options. Trade routes snake through this landscape, salt from the desert, fish from rivers. Vegetables don't travel far, but seeds do. Someone pockets a few, carries them to another settlement, experiments. Some plants adapt, others fail. Failure is common. No one writes about it. but those failures determine which vegetables disappear early, long before colonial disruption enters the picture. Another grounded fact settles in. Iron tools, increasingly available through trade, change farming. Clearing land becomes easier. Certain crops benefit. Others, especially shade-loving or slow-growing greens, lose ground as fields expand. Efficiency begins to compete with diversity. Not aggressively yet, but enough to tilt the balance. You crouch near a farmer explaining soil to a younger listener. Dark soil means this leaf. Sandy soil means another. Floodplain greens taste better but spoil faster. This is science without paperwork. It's empirical, tested every season, adjusted after every bad harvest. And it's fragile. Disrupt the chain of transmission, war, migration, disease, and the knowledge goes with it. Here's where the unease creeps in. You realize how easy it is for a vegetable to vanish without drama. No catastrophe required. Just one generation deciding something else is easier to grow, easier to sell, easier to explain to outsiders. Convenience again. Always convenience. A light joke drifts in to keep you from spiraling. Somewhere in this market, someone is absolutely being overcharged for wilted leaves and pretending not to notice because social harmony matters more than honesty. Some traditions never die. As the sun shifts, the market thins. Unsold vegetables are taken home, cooked, dried, or fed to animals. Nothing is wasted, but not everything is remembered. Some plants don't get replanted. Seeds aren't saved. A gap opens quietly in the agricultural calendar, and no one notices until decades later, when someone says, "Didn't our grandparents eat something else during this season?" That question hangs in the air as you drift onward. From kitchens to markets, from markets to fields, the vegetables are already slipping through your fingers, and the kingdoms haven't even arrived yet. You don't notice the walls at first. They rise gradually, woven into the landscape the way authority often is. Quiet until it isn't. One moment you're moving through open fields and market paths, and the next you're inside a royal compound, where land is no longer shared by default, but claimed, measured, and guarded. The air smells cleaner here, less dust, more water. You've stepped into the gardens behind the walls. These are not decorative gardens in the modern sense. No one is planting for aesthetics alone. Every plot is intentional, arranged to feed status as much as stomachs. Shade trees cast long shadows over low-growing greens. Irrigation channels glint faintly, redirecting water with the kind of patience only power can afford. You feel it immediately. Resources flow inward here. Here's a mainstream historical fact to keep you grounded. West African kingdoms, such as Mali, Songhai, and Benin, maintained controlled agricultural zones near palaces to ensure reliable food supplies for elites, ritual specialists, and retainers. These zones often received preferential water access and labor. What grew here mattered, because it reflected royal taste, and royal taste shaped trends far beyond the walls. You watch gardeners tending plants that look familiar from the markets, but also others you didn't see outside. These are the high-maintenance vegetables, the ones that bruise easily, that demand specific soil, that don't tolerate neglect. Commoners might grow them occasionally, but here they're reliable, protected, privileged. If vegetables had social classes, these would be wearing silk. A gardener pinches a leaf, tastes it, frowns, and adjusts the shade covering. Too much sun makes it tough. Too little, and it loses flavor. This level of micromanagement doesn't scale. That's the point. Royal gardens aren't about feeding everyone. They're about distinction. You eat this because others cannot. Power, served lightly boiled. There's an unspoken consequence you can't ignore. Once elite kitchens favor certain vegetables, others start to lose prestige. A green associated with palace meals becomes desirable. One associated with rural subsistence becomes something you'd rather not be seen eating once you've made it. This is how disappearance begins socially, long before it happens biologically. A quirky tidbit drifts in as you linger. Some royal gardens included test plots where unfamiliar plants, often brought as tribute from distant regions, were grown experimentally. Not all survived. Some tasted bad, some caused stomach issues. A few were quietly removed from memory after making someone important uncomfortable. Historians still argue whether certain lost vegetables vanished due to ecological change, or because a ruler simply didn't like the taste. Petty? Yes. Plausible? Absolutely. You follow a narrow path toward the kitchen side of the compound. Here, Gardeners and cooks interact directly. Feedback loops exist. That leaf boiled too fast. This one made the stew cloudy. Adjustments follow. This is applied research. No grants, no journals, just consequences. Another solid fact anchors you. Royal households often set culinary norms that rippled outward. When elites adopted or abandoned ingredients, traders and farmers responded. If palace demand dropped, a vegetable might still grow in villages, but its market value would decline. Over time, less incentive meant less planting. Economics doesn't need paperwork to work. You pause beside a bed of greens that smell faintly metallic. They're valued not for taste, but for strength, associated with blood, vitality, recovery after illness. These are functional vegetables. You don't eat them for pleasure, you eat them because they do something to you. Modern nutritionists would nod approvingly. Modern eaters might complain on social media. Here comes the scholarly uncertainty because it deserves space. Historians still argue whether royal preference actively suppressed certain indigenous vegetables or merely accelerated existing trends toward easier, faster-yielding crops. In other words, were kings killing these vegetables or just failing to save them? Intent matters less than outcome. The outcome is absence. You lean against a wall and feel the quiet. Gardens absorb sound. This is controlled calm. Outside, markets buzz. Inside, everything moves slower, more deliberate. Slowness is a luxury. Some vegetables require it. Long growing periods, careful harvesting, complex preparation. When speed becomes valuable because of population growth, conflict, or labor demands, these vegetables start to look inefficient. A light joke slips in because your brain needs one. Somewhere in this garden, a gardener absolutely knows more about plants than the ruler does, and keeps that to themselves for job security. Knowledge is power, but only if you survive wielding it. As the day cools, you realize how fragile this system is. Royal gardens depend on stability. War, drought, succession disputes. Any of these can disrupt maintenance. When gardens collapse, the first vegetables to vanish are the fussy ones. The resilient survive. Taste and tradition take a backseat to calories. You leave the garden knowing something uncomfortable. Preservation often depends on privilege. When that privilege disappears, so do the things it protected. Many of these vegetables were never meant to survive without walls, labor, and attention. Once those vanish, the plants follow. And with that realization settling heavy but quiet in your chest, you move on, deeper into the meanings attached to what people chose to eat. You don't step anywhere new this time. You stay close to the pot, close to the body, close to the idea that food is never just food. The vegetables you've been watching aren't only nourishment anymore. They've crossed into meaning. You feel it in how carefully certain leaves are handled, how some are set aside, how others are avoided on specific days. This is where eating turns symbolic, whether anyone admits it or not. You're inside a space where health, ritual, and authority blur together. Greens are chosen not just for taste or availability, but for what they are believed to do to a person, strengthening blood, cooling the body, settling the stomach, sharpening the mind. In these kitchens, vegetables are quiet tools of governance. A ruler who eats well is a ruler who stays upright. Literally, here's your mainstream historical anchor. In many West African societies, food and medicine were deeply intertwined. There was no hard boundary between cuisine and healing. Leafy vegetables in particular were valued for their perceived medicinal properties, and were often prescribed by healers as part of everyday diets, not emergency treatment. You didn't take medicine, you ate it. You watch a cook separate leaves into different piles, one for elders, one for women recovering after childbirth, one for warriors before long journeys. This isn't superstition in the dismissive sense. It's observation stretched across generations. Eat this too often and you feel weak. Eat that after illness and you recover faster. No lab coats, just consequences. A pot simmers with dark green contents, thicker than before. This is not celebratory food. This is corrective food. Bitterness dominates. Sweetness is absent on purpose. Pleasure is not the goal. Control is. Even your modern brain understands this instinctively. Comfort food versus I need to fix my life food. Same concept. Older packaging. A quirky tidbit drifts in as you watch someone refuse a dish politely. Certain vegetables were avoided before rituals or political gatherings because they were thought to dull alertness or inflame emotions. Imagine being banned from eating a specific leaf. because it might make you argumentative at council meetings. Honestly, that might solve a lot of modern problems. You notice something else. Vegetables associated with strength and purity are praised publicly. Others, eaten in private, carry quieter reputations. Some are linked to fertility, some to mourning, some to poverty. These associations stick. Long after the original reasoning fades, the stigma remains. This is how a nutritionally valuable plant becomes low-status food. Historians still argue whether these symbolic roles helped preserve certain vegetables longer or hasten their disappearance. Did ritual importance protect them from abandonment? Or did rigid associations limit their adaptability when social conditions changed? No clean answer. Culture giveth, culture taketh away. You lean closer to the fire and feel sweat bead at your temples. Heat matters here. Certain leaves are believed to heat the body. Others cool it. Balance is everything. Eat the wrong thing at the wrong time, and illness isn't bad luck. It's poor judgment. This framework governs daily choices more effectively than written rules ever could. Another fact settles in. These food philosophies shaped agricultural priorities. Vegetables thought to promote vitality were encouraged. Others, associated with weakness or desperation, were tolerated only when necessary. Over time, farmers responded to demand, shaped not by yield, but by belief. Belief is a powerful market force. A light joke slips through the steam. Somewhere, someone absolutely blamed a bad mood on the wrong vegetable, and not on their own terrible decisions. Human nature hasn't evolved that much. As you stand there, you realize how fragile meaning is. Once the social structures that enforce these beliefs weaken, through migration, religious change, colonial rule, the vegetables tied to them lose their protection. A leaf that mattered because of ritual loses relevance when the ritual disappears. And unlike grains, vegetables don't always justify themselves on calories alone. You taste the stew in your imagination. It's not pleasant, it's purposeful. And purpose is harder to maintain than pleasure. When these belief systems fracture, people don't necessarily stop eating vegetables. They just stop eating these ones. New foods arrive with new meanings, often simpler ones. Tasty, filling, familiar. The old greens, heavy with symbolism, quietly step aside. You let that settle as the fire crackles lower. Vegetables once cooked into power are already loosening their grip on memory. And you can feel the next shift coming, the moment when outsiders arrive and fail to notice any of this at all. You don't hear them arrive. That's the unsettling part. There's no dramatic announcement, no cinematic cut, just new voices at the edge of the soundscape. Foreign accents, different rhythms of speech, the scrape of unfamiliar sandals, travelers, traders, chroniclers, people who will later be treated as sources, even though they barely understand what they're looking at. You're standing near the same kitchens, the same markets, but now you're seeing them through borrowed eyes. And those eyes slide right past the vegetables. Here's the uncomfortable mainstream fact you need early. Much of what we know about pre-colonial West African foodways comes from external observers, Arab geographers, North African scholars, later European traders, whose interests lay in gold, salt, religion, and political structure. Everyday foods, especially vegetables, were considered too ordinary to record unless they were exotic, intoxicating, or profitable. So you watch a traveler describe a feast in loving detail. He notes the meat, the spices, the oil, the abundance. He might mention greens once, vaguely, like background noise. No names, no preparation methods, no curiosity, as if plants that didn't travel well didn't matter. This is how invisibility starts, not with destruction, but with indifference. You stand beside a pot bubbling with a leafy stew that's been cooked the same way for generations. The cook knows its name, the diners know its effects. The traveler tastes it, nods, and moves on. To him, it's interchangeable. To the record, it's non-existent. A quirky but telling tidbit floats in. Some early accounts describe West African meals as simple or rustic, despite clearly complex preparation methods. Why? Because vegetables were associated with peasant food in the observer's own cultures. If it wasn't bread or wine or meat, it barely registered as civilization. Bias isn't loud, it's lazy. Historians still argue whether the absence of vegetable detail in written sources reflects actual dietary emphasis, or simply the blind spots of those doing the writing. Did vegetables decline later, or were they always central but never documented? The silence makes it impossible to say with certainty. And silence, once printed, carries authority. You follow one chronicler as he walks through a market. He notes the bustle, the goods, the order. He lists grains, mentions yams. Vegetables blur together. Leaves, he writes, plural. That's it. 100 species reduced to one word. Another fact settles in quietly. Oral cultures preserve detail through repetition and relevance, not abstraction. Written cultures preserve what the writer finds noteworthy. When one replaces the other as history, entire categories of knowledge vanish, not because they were unimportant, but because they were too familiar to explain. You feel the imbalance forming. These written records will later be treated as baseline truth. Archaeology will be forced to work around them. Oral histories will be questioned if they don't align. Vegetables, already perishable in soil, become perishable in memory. A light joke slides in to keep you from getting too irritated. Somewhere, a chronicler absolutely misheard a vegetable's name, wrote it down wrong, and then confidently moved on with his life. Academic legacy intact. As time moves forward, this bias compounds. Later outsiders read earlier outsiders. Errors echo. Omissions harden. A vegetable not mentioned becomes a vegetable that didn't matter. And once something's assumed not to matter, no one looks for it. You realize how dangerous that is. Because absence in the record is often mistaken for absence in reality, especially when the reality belonged to people who didn't control the pen. You watch another meal go by unrecorded, another pot emptied, another seed saved by someone whose name won't survive. The vegetables continue their quiet work, feeding, healing, sustaining, while history keeps its gaze fixed elsewhere. By the time the world starts paying closer attention to West Africa, many of these plants will already be gone, and no one will even know what questions to ask. You let that thought fade gently, because getting angry won't help you sleep. But the lesson sticks. If no one bothers to name a thing, it becomes very easy to lose it. You feel it before anyone says it out loud. The heat lasts longer, the rains hesitate. Seasons blur at the edges, arriving late or leaving early like guests who've forgotten the schedule. No one here calls it climate change, but everyone adjusts their habits. You're standing in fields where vegetables are no longer judged only by taste or tradition, but by stubbornness. This is where nature starts editing the menu. Here's your grounding fact. West Africa has always experienced climatic variability, including periodic droughts and shifting rainfall patterns, long before modern industrial warming. Communities adapted by favoring crops, especially vegetables, that could survive erratic conditions, poor soils, and heat stress. Resilience wasn't optional, it was survival. You watch farmers crouch low, inspecting leaves with practiced skepticism. This one wilts too fast, that one bolts early. Another survives, but tastes increasingly bitter as conditions worsen. Bitterness becomes acceptable. Loss becomes normal. Some vegetables simply can't keep up. They need reliable moisture, shade, time. When rains shorten or become unpredictable, these plants fail quietly. No famine announcement, just empty patches in the garden that don't get replanted next season. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you move along a field edge. Certain leafy greens were traditionally planted as weather readers. If they thrived, the season would be kind. If they struggled, people adjusted planting schedules for other crops. When those indicator plants disappeared, communities lost not just food, but forecasting tools. Imagine deleting the weather app and pretending it doesn't matter. Historians still argue whether climate pressure alone was enough to erase some indigenous vegetables, or whether social and economic changes simply made people less willing to invest effort in fragile crops. Climate doesn't act alone. It collaborates with human priorities. Always has. You feel the logic harden. If a vegetable demands attention you can't afford, you stop growing it. Not because you hate it, because you're tired, because you have children to feed, because the rains don't care about nostalgia. Another anchor settles in. Drought-resistant crops, often grains or hardy tubers, expand during periods of stress, reducing space for diverse vegetables. Fields simplify, diversity contracts. It's efficient, it's tragic. Both things can be true at once. You notice something subtle. When vegetables fail repeatedly, people stop teaching how to cook them. Knowledge follows practice. No practice, no transmission. Recipes don't survive on principle, they survive on repetition. A light joke drifts in, dries the season itself. Somewhere, someone absolutely declares a vegetable cursed when it's really just bad rainfall and worse timing. Superstition is often climate anxiety wearing a costume. You pause near a garden where only the toughest greens remain. They're coarse, fibrous, hard on the jaw, but they grow. These are the survivors, the ones history will remember, not because they're best, but because they're last. Here's the uncomfortable part you can't ignore. Once taste adapts to scarcity, abundance feels unnecessary. People recalibrate expectations. A vegetable that once seemed delicate now seems fussy. Why bother? This psychological shift outlives the drought itself. Historians still argue whether certain vegetables could have been saved if climatic conditions later improved, or whether cultural abandonment sealed their fate permanently. By the time conditions stabilized, the seeds were gone. And without seeds, recovery is theoretical at best. You feel the ground crack slightly underfoot, not dramatic, just enough to remind you that landscapes remember stress longer than people do. Soil changes, microclimates shift. Some plants never get a second chance. As the heat presses down, you realize how unfair it is to blame disappearance on climate alone. Climate sets the challenge. Humans choose the response. And often, that response favors endurance over diversity. You move on, knowing that the next force won't be subtle at all. When convenience meets pressure, tradition rarely wins. You hear the sound before you see the work. Thud, pause, thud. The rhythm is steady, almost meditative. A wooden pestle meeting stone again and again. You're back inside a compound, but this time your attention isn't on what grows. It's on what it takes to make it edible. This is where many vegetables quietly lose their future. Some of these greens are stubborn, fibrous, slightly toxic if handled wrong. They don't surrender easily. They demand time, strength, and patience. You watch someone pound leaves until their arms ache, breaking cell walls, leaching bitterness, turning something barely chewable into nourishment. This is not cooking as relaxation. This is cooking as labor. Here's the historical anchor you need. Pre-colonial West African food preparation often involved intensive processing, pounding, fermenting, soaking, to make plants digestible and safe. These techniques expanded the range of edible vegetables dramatically. Without them, many indigenous greens would never have been eaten at all. You lean closer to the grinding stone. The smell changes as enzymes release, bitterness softening into something deeper and greener. This is chemistry, whether anyone names it or not. Knowledge lives in muscle memory. Skip a step, and the dish fails, or worse, makes someone sick. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you watch an apprentice struggle. Some communities use taste testing hierarchies. The least experienced tasted last, or not at all. Elders went first because they knew what wrong tasted like. That's trust, mixed with risk, passed down daily. OSHA would have opinions. Historians still argue whether the labor demands of traditional vegetable preparation significantly contributed to their decline once easier processing foods became available. In other words, did people abandon these vegetables because they wanted variety, or because they were exhausted? The answer is probably yes. You notice the difference immediately when a new ingredient appears. A leaf that wilts quickly, needs less pounding, cooks faster, time matters, labor matters. When households grow larger, when workdays lengthen, when social structures shift, efficiency starts winning arguments tradition can't defend. Another fact grounds you. As iron tools and later imported cookware became more common, cooking methods changed. Boiling replaced pounding in some cases. Frying replaced slow simmering. Vegetables that didn't adapt well to these methods quietly fell out of rotation. If a plant doesn't suit your tools, it becomes inconvenient. You feel the weight of that. Technology isn't neutral, it selects. A light joke slips in to keep you from getting too grim. Somewhere, someone absolutely forgot a labor-intensive vegetable, not because they disliked it, but because their arms were sore and they had better things to do. Relatable across centuries. You watch as one dish takes hours to prepare, while another is ready in minutes. Guess which one survives when time is tight. Guess which one parents stop teaching their children to make. Skills die when they're no longer useful. There's another layer here that's easy to miss. Communal cooking once distributed labor. As social structures change, smaller households, more individualized work, those systems weaken. A vegetable that requires 3 people and a free afternoon becomes impractical. Not bad, just impractical. Historians still argue whether this shift happened gradually from internal social change or was accelerated by external pressures like trade, taxation, and later colonial labor demands. Again, intention matters less than outcome. The outcome is absence. You step back from the grinding stone and realize something quietly devastating. Preparation techniques are as much a part of biodiversity as seeds. Lose the technique, and the plant might as well be extinct. You can't eat what you don't know how to handle. As the pounding slows and the pot is set to boil, you feel the thread tightening. Vegetables that demanded patience are already losing ground. And the next force coming doesn't care about patience at all. You barely notice the change at first. It happens quietly, the way habits always do. A little more oil here, a new spice there. The vegetables are still present, still green and familiar, but they're no longer the center of attention. They're becoming background actors in their own story. This is the age of sauces. You're standing over a pot where flavors layer instead of stand alone. Heat, fat, salt, fermented depth. The leaf you once tasted clearly, bitter, grassy, sharp, is now softened, blurred, absorbed. It's not gone. It's just harder to identify. And that matters more than you think. Here's the historical anchor. West African cuisines developed complex sauce-based cooking traditions, where vegetables were often combined with oils, seeds, fermented ingredients, and later spices to create rich, unified flavors. These sauces were efficient, scalable, and adaptable across regions and social classes. They fed many mouths with fewer ingredients. Efficiency wins again. You watch a cook stir, tasting not for the leaf, but for balance. Too thin? Add something. Too sharp? Mask it. Vegetables that once defined a dish now serve structure. Thickening, color, body. Their individual identities fade. If a leaf can be swapped without anyone noticing, it becomes replaceable. Replaceable things don't last. A quirky tidbit floats in through the steam. Some sauces were deliberately designed to tame vegetables with unpleasant reputations. Bitterness, covered, astringency, softened. Medicinal funk, buried. This made hard-to-love greens acceptable, but also forgettable. You don't remember what you can't taste. Historians still argue whether sauce-centered cooking preserved vegetable diversity longer by keeping marginal plants in use, or hastened loss by erasing their distinctiveness. Did sauces save these vegetables, or did they quietly suffocate them? The answer depends on whether you value survival in any form, or survival as itself. You lean closer and realize how powerful this shift is. When a vegetable no longer carries its own name in conversation, when it's just the green in the sauce, it's already halfway out the door. Children learn flavors, not components. They remember heat and richness, not leaves. Another grounded fact settles in. As populations grew and urban centers expanded, cooking needed to be faster, cheaper, and more forgiving. Sauces allowed for substitution. If one vegetable failed, another could step in. Flexibility fed cities, but it also flattened diversity. A light joke slips in because your brain needs relief. Somewhere, a cook absolutely replaced one leaf with another and said, "No one will notice." And they were completely right. Tragic, efficient, iconic. You think back to the grinding stones, to the careful preparation. Sauces reduce that labor. Chop, boil, stir, done. Vegetables that once demanded respect now demand compliance. If they don't cooperate, they don't get invited. There's another layer here, subtle but sharp. As flavors converge, cultural memory thins. You remember how something tastes, not what made it taste that way. When ingredients change slowly over generations, no one notices until it's too late to reverse. Historians still argue whether this culinary convergence was driven primarily by internal innovation or by exposure to external taste through trade. Either way, the result is the same. Specificity gives way to generality. You stand there, listening to the pot bubble steadily, realizing how quiet this kind of loss is. No famine, no ban, no decree, just a slow blending until distinction disappears. The vegetables aren't gone yet, but they're losing their voices, and once a plant stops speaking clearly on the tongue, history stops listening. You feel the disruption before you understand it. The soil is the same color, the sun rises the same way, but something unfamiliar is growing in the garden beds. The leaves look wrong, too smooth, too eager. The fruits swell faster than anything you've seen so far. These plants don't ask for patience. They promise results. This is where intrusion stops being subtle. Here's the hard historical fact up front. From the late 15th century onward, new crops from the Americas, in Asia, maize, cassava, chili peppers, peanuts, entered West African food systems through global trade. These plants often produced higher yields, tolerated varied conditions, and fit neatly into emerging colonial economic structures. They didn't arrive as villains. They arrived as solutions. You watch farmers experiment. This new plant grows fast. It feeds more people per plot. It doesn't demand careful pounding or long soaking. It doesn't carry heavy ritual baggage. It's efficient, neutral, convenient. That combination is lethal to older vegetables already struggling under climate pressure and labor fatigue. A colonial administrator strolls through a garden, uninterested in local greens, but deeply invested in what can be counted, taxed, exported. He encourages crops that fit his ledger. Vegetables that feed households but don't generate surplus or profit lose relevance fast. If a plant doesn't show up in reports, it might as well not exist. A quirky but telling tidbit slides in here. Some indigenous vegetables were dismissed as weeds by colonial botanists because they didn't match European classification systems or commercial expectations. Edible, medicinal, culturally loaded weeds. That label stuck. Once something is called a weed, no one funds its survival. Historians still argue whether colonial policies actively suppressed indigenous vegetables or simply created conditions where imported crops crowded them out. Forced labor systems, cash crop demands, and land reorganization certainly didn't help. But again, intent matters less than outcome. Fields simplify. Diversity shrinks. You notice how quickly tastes adapt. Chili peppers arrive, and people fall in love. Heat becomes central. Old bitter greens can't compete. Not because they're worse, but because they don't deliver the same immediate sensory punch. Palates change faster than traditions can defend themselves. Another fact grounds you. Colonial agriculture prioritized predictability. Uniform crops, clear planting cycles, standardized outputs. Indigenous vegetables, with their local specificity and irregular yields, didn't fit, so they were ignored, discouraged, or simply forgotten. A light joke drifts in, dry as a colonial report. Somewhere, a bureaucrat absolutely declared a crop inefficient without ever tasting it. History is written by people who don't cook. You feel the imbalance harden. Imported crops start showing up in markets, then in kitchens, then in memory. Children grow up thinking these are traditional. The timeline collapses. What arrived recently feels ancient. What is ancient feels strange. Historians still argue whether any significant number of indigenous vegetables could have survived if colonial rule had ended earlier or taken a different form. Counterfactuals are comforting. Reality is not. Once seeds are lost and habits reset, revival becomes uphill work. You stand at the edge of a field where new crops dominate. The old vegetables cling to margins, fence lines, forest edges, places no one bothers to optimize. That's always where the past hides when the future shows up with paperwork. As you move on, you realize this wasn't conquest by force alone. It was conquest by convenience, accounting, and appetite. The vegetables didn't lose a war, they lost relevance. And relevance, once gone, is almost impossible to reclaim. You don't find these vegetables in fields anymore. You find them in voices, in pauses, in the way someone hesitates before saying, "There used to be a leaf." This is where agriculture gives way to memory, and memory does most of the heavy lifting. You're sitting with elders now, not in a formal archive, but under shade where conversation drifts. Names surface, half forgotten, mispronounced, argued over. Someone swears a plant tasted sour. Someone else insists it was sweet. Both might be right. Plants change depending on soil, rain, and who cooked them. Here's your grounding fact. In many West African cultures, oral tradition serves as a primary archive for agricultural and culinary knowledge, especially for foods that were never commercialized or written about. When cultivation stops, memory often outlives practice, sometimes by generations. You listen as someone describes a leaf that grew wild near streams. eaten mostly by children and elders. Another remembers a vegetable used only during certain months, when the ground felt tired. That phrase sticks with you. Agricultural calendars encoded emotionally, not numerically. A quirky tidbit surfaces as someone laughs mid-story. Some lost vegetables survive only as insults or metaphors in local languages. Calling someone that leaf implies weakness, bitterness, or uselessness. The plant is gone, but the joke remains. Linguistic fossils are still fossils. Historians still argue whether oral accounts of lost vegetables can be reliably matched to known species, or whether they describe plants that are truly extinct, or never botanically classified in the first place. Memory preserves shape and function, not Latin names. Science struggles with that. You notice how fragile this transmission is. One generation skips telling, another doesn't ask. Suddenly the vegetable isn't just unplanted, it's unnamed. And unnamed things don't get searched for. Another fact settles in quietly. Colonial education systems often devalued local knowledge, labeling it backward or unscientific. Younger generations learned new crops, new cuisines, new priorities. Oral culinary history lost prestige. Elders talked, fewer listened. A light joke drifts in, gentle but sharp. Somewhere, someone absolutely forgot a vegetable's name mid-story and said, "You know that one." And everyone nodded, pretending they did. Collective amnesia is polite like that. You realize something unsettling. Memory isn't static. Each retelling edits, exaggerates, simplifies. A vegetable that required complex preparation becomes easy. One eaten rarely becomes everyday. Over time, memory smooths out the inconvenient parts. When someone tries to revive the plant later, reality doesn't match the story. Historians still argue whether this distortion helps or hinders revival efforts. Romanticized memory can inspire interest, but it can also set unrealistic expectations. People want the idea of the vegetable, not the labor. You sit longer, listening to silences between words. Some stories trail off, not because the speaker is done, but because the details are gone. This is loss without drama, no burning fields, just gaps. As the sun shifts, you feel the urgency. Once the last person who tasted a plant dies, recovery becomes archaeology or luck. Seeds might still exist somewhere, or not. You won't know until you look. You stand and move on, carrying voices with you. The vegetables are thinner now, less physical, more fragile. And the next place you're going will try to pin them down with science, whether they cooperate or not. You shift from conversation to consultation. The space changes. Calabash bowls give way to bundles of dried leaves hung carefully from rafters. This is where cooks hand responsibility to healers. And the vegetables that vanished from daily meals linger a little longer, tolerated because they still do something useful. You're watching a different kind of selection at work. Here's the grounding fact first. Across West African societies, many leafy vegetables occupied dual roles as both food and medicine. When culinary use declined, medicinal use often persisted, preserving certain plants long after they disappeared from everyday diets. Healing bought them time. You see it in the way these leaves are handled, measured, not heaped, boiled alone instead of mixed into sauces, consumed briefly, not leisurely. This isn't comfort food. This is intervention. You don't eat it because you want to. You eat it because something is wrong. A healer explains, calmly without drama, that this leaf cools fevers, that one strengthens blood, another clears heaviness. The language is metaphorical, but the outcomes are observed. Some vegetables earn their survival by being effective, not pleasant. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you listen. Some medicinal greens were intentionally kept out of regular meals to preserve their potency and seriousness. If everyone eats it casually, it stops feeling medicinal. Scarcity maintains authority. Imagine being told you can't add something to dinner because it might dilute its spiritual brand. Historians still argue whether medicinal framing preserved these vegetables or isolated them into irrelevance. Once a plant is labeled medicine, it often stops being seen as food at all, and food knowledge spreads faster than medical knowledge, especially when formal healthcare systems arrive and push traditional remedies aside. You notice how preparation shifts. Precision replaces abundance. The pounding is gentler, the boiling shorter. Too much and it becomes harmful. Too little and it does nothing. This narrowing of acceptable use makes the vegetable fragile. One mistake, and people stop trusting it. Another fact settles in. Colonial and post-colonial medical systems frequently dismissed plant-based treatments as unscientific, even when they were effective. As clinics and pharmaceuticals spread, medicinal vegetables lost legitimacy, not because they failed, but because they couldn't be patented. A light joke slips in, dry but accurate. Somewhere, a plant that worked perfectly well for centuries got replaced by something with a label and a leaflet. Progress, apparently. You feel the tension sharpen. These vegetables survive, but only on borrowed time. They're no longer taught to children as food. They're guarded by specialists. Knowledge bottlenecks. When healers die without apprentices, the plants lose their last advocates. Historians still argue whether any significant number of lost vegetables might have survived if culinary and medicinal knowledge had remained integrated instead of splitting apart. Once divided, both halves weaken. The cook forgets the medicine. The healer forgets the flavor. You stand there, watching a bundle of leaves being carefully rewrapped. This is preservation through restriction. It works, for a while, but it doesn't scale, and it doesn't inspire affection. As you move away, you understand the pattern clearly now. Vegetables that couldn't justify themselves as food tried to survive as medicine. Some succeeded, most didn't, because once a plant stops being part of daily life, it becomes optional. And optional things are the first to disappear. The path ahead gets colder, harsher, because now you're heading into moments when vegetables were eaten, not because they were valued, but because there was nothing else. You feel the shift immediately. The mood tightens. The talk gets quieter. Vegetables stop being discussed with pride or nostalgia and start being described with a shrug. This is where food loses status and gains shame. You're standing in a season people don't like to remember. Nothing ceremonial happens here. No rituals, no royal gardens. Just hunger pressing close enough that taste becomes irrelevant. Here's the historical anchor you need. Throughout West African history, periods of famine and food scarcity, caused by drought, conflict, disrupted trade, or forced labor, pushed communities to rely on emergency foods, including wild or semi-cultivated vegetables, normally avoided or eaten only as a last resort. These foods kept people alive. They also earned a reputation. You watch people gather leaves from field edges, riverbanks, places normally ignored. The preparation is rushed. No careful pounding. No seasoning beyond salt, if that. This isn't cuisine, it's triage. A child complains about bitterness and is told sharply to eat. The message is clear. This food is punishment adjacent. Survival doesn't get applause. A quirky but revealing tidbit slips in. In some regions, famine vegetables were nicknamed with euphemisms that roughly translate to the thing you don't mention later. People ate them, then pretended they hadn't. Culinary denial is a coping strategy. Historians still argue whether the stigma attached to famine foods was stronger than their nutritional value in determining their long-term disappearance. In other words, did people stop eating these vegetables because better options returned, or because they never wanted to be reminded of needing them? You already know the answer feels uncomfortably human. Another fact settles in. Once a food becomes associated with desperation, it struggles to recover socially. Even when conditions improve, people avoid it to signal stability. Eating normal food becomes proof that life is back under control. The famine vegetable gets left behind, even if it's hearty, nutritious, and perfectly edible. You feel how fast this happens. One bad season turns into a label. A few years of avoidance turn into lost knowledge. Seeds aren't saved. Preparation techniques fade. Children grow up thinking that plant was never meant to be eaten at all. A light joke drifts in, because even misery has gallows humor. Somewhere, someone absolutely said, "We'll laugh about this later," and then made sure they never cooked that vegetable again. Coping looks like forgetting. You notice something else. Shame changes stories. Elders gloss over these foods when teaching the young. They focus on celebratory dishes, not survival ones. History becomes aspirational, not accurate. An aspirational history edits out famine vegetables aggressively. Historians still argue whether any of these plants could have been rehabilitated with time and positive framing, or whether the emotional damage was irreversible. Once a vegetable tastes like fear, it's hard to make it taste like comfort again. You stand at the edge of a field where a famine green still grows wild, ignored even now. It doesn't know it was rejected. It keeps thriving, resilient, unbothered by human psychology. That might be the cruelest part. As food security returns, people plant what feels safe, familiar, respected. The emergency greens are left to fend for themselves. And without human attention, most of them don't last long. You move on knowing this. Some vegetables didn't disappear because they failed people. They disappeared because they succeeded when people didn't want to remember failing. You leave the fields and kitchens behind and step into a quieter kind of investigation. There are no stories being told out loud here, no elders arguing over taste, just fragments, burned, cracked, ground into residue. This is where the past stops speaking and starts whispering. You're crouched beside broken cooking pots pulled from the earth. Here's the grounding fact before your mind drifts too far. Archaeologists studying West African sites increasingly rely on micro-remains, charred plant fragments, starch grains, phytoliths, and residues absorbed into pottery to reconstruct ancient diets. Vegetables rarely survive intact, but they leave chemical fingerprints if you know where to look. You watch a researcher brush dirt from a pot rim. To the untrained eye, it's nothing. To someone patient enough, it's evidence. A faint residue clinging to porous clay, locked in centuries ago when a stew boiled too long, or burned slightly at the bottom. That mistake becomes data. A quirky tidbit surfaces here. Some of the best preserved vegetable evidence exists precisely because cooks messed up. Burnt food sticks. Perfect food disappears. Archaeology rewards failure more than success. Comforting in a strange way. Historians still argue whether residue analysis can ever reliably distinguish between closely related leafy vegetables, especially when sauces blurred flavors and compositions. A starch grain can tell you something was eaten. It rarely tells you what, with confidence. Science has limits, and vegetables love hiding in those gaps. You move between excavation sites in your mind. Inland settlements, riverine towns, old capitals. Patterns emerge. Certain residues appear early, then vanish from later layers. Not replaced by nothing, replaced by something else. Imported crops, simplified diets. The absence has a timestamp. Another fact settles in quietly. Archaeological visibility favors durable foods. Grains carbonize well. Tubers sometimes leave traces. Leafy vegetables, they rot, dissolve, vanish. Their absence in the record doesn't mean absence in life, but their disappearance from the record makes it easier to forget they were ever there. You feel the frustration archaeologists feel. They know something's missing, they just can't always prove it. Oral histories hint at leaves eaten daily. Pots say otherwise. Somewhere between those truths lies reality. A light joke drifts in, dry and academic. Somewhere, a vegetable that fed thousands for centuries is now represented by a dot on a chart labeled unknown plant matter. Legacy secured. You watch as samples are cataloged, boxed, archived. The process is slow, expensive, and selective. Not every site gets studied. Not every pot gets tested. Funding shapes history just as much as fire and rain ever did. Historians still argue whether current archaeological methods underestimate vegetable diversity in pre-colonial diets, skewing reconstructions toward grains and meats. Most likely, yes. But acknowledging that doesn't magically fill the gaps. You realize something important here. Archaeology doesn't resurrect lost vegetables, it just proves they existed. It gives weight to memory. It turns someone said into something happened. That's valuable, but it's not enough to bring seeds back. As you stand and stretch, dust clinging to your clothes, you understand the cruelty of time. The better a vegetable was at nourishing quietly, the worse it is at surviving history. And yet, these pots matter. They push back against silence. They tell you loss happened, and roughly when. Which means, for the first time in this journey, you're not just mourning disappearance, you're measuring it. You step out of the archive and into something quieter but oddly hopeful. There's no crowd, no empire, just a few people kneeling in soil with notebooks, plastic bags, and an intensity that borders on obsession. These are not farmers in the old sense, they are revivalists, and they are trying to reverse time with patience and paperwork. Here's your grounding fact. Across West Africa today, botanists, agroecologists, and cultural activists are working to identify, conserve, and reintroduce indigenous vegetables using seed banks, community gardens, and oral history-informed fieldwork. This isn't nostalgia, it's risk management. Crop diversity matters when climates misbehave. You watch someone compare leaves to an old description recorded decades earlier. Another consults an elder about bitterness, texture, cooking time. This is detective work with dirt under its nails. The goal isn't to recreate the past perfectly, it's to recover options. A quirky tidbit surfaces as a researcher laughs. Sometimes a lost vegetable turns out to be growing just fine. Classified as a weed, ignored, stepped on daily. Lost to prestige, not biology. You can't conserve what you refuse to respect. Historians still argue whether revival efforts should prioritize historical accuracy or modern adaptability. Should a vegetable be grown exactly as it was, or modified to suit current tastes and labor realities? Purists say preserve. Pragmatists say evolve. Plants don't care. People do. You notice the tension immediately. One revived leaf tastes bitter. Too bitter for most modern palates. Someone suggests selective breeding. Someone else bristles. Change it too much and it's not the same plant. This argument will never end. And that's fine. Debate means interest. Interest means survival. Another fact settles in. Global seed banks historically underrepresented African indigenous vegetables, focusing instead on globally traded staples. That's changing slowly. But slowly is dangerous when ecosystems move faster than institutions. A light joke drifts in, because even revival needs humor. Somewhere, a revived vegetable is absolutely being rebranded with a trendier name to make people care. Marketing saves what history ignored. You feel the realism here. Revival isn't romantic. Some plants fail again. Some are rejected by consumers. Some don't fit modern kitchens or schedules. Labor still matters. Convenience still wins many fights. Historians still argue whether revival can ever truly restore lost food cultures, or whether it inevitably creates something new wearing old labels. Probably the second. And that's not a failure. It's honesty. You kneel, touch the soil, and feel the same contradiction running through this entire journey. The past can inform, it can warn, it can inspire, but it cannot be reinstalled like software. As you stand, you realize this is the first time in the story where loss isn't the final word. The vegetables aren't guaranteed a future, but they're no longer silent, and that matters more than you expected. You slow down without being told to. The soil, the pots, the voices, the arguments, all of it fades into a softer focus. What's left now isn't a field or a kitchen. It's a question that doesn't need answering tonight. You think about the last harvest of a vegetable no one marked as last. No ceremony, no warning. Someone simply didn't plant it again. Seeds stayed in a gourd too long. Knowledge skipped a generation. And that was it. Extinction without witnesses. Here's the final grounding fact before you drift. Food biodiversity loss is rarely dramatic. It happens through thousands of small, reasonable decisions, each one logical in isolation, devastating in accumulation. Lost vegetables are not evidence of ignorance. They are evidence of pressure. Historians still argue whether more of these vegetables would have survived if people had valued taste over yield, diversity over efficiency, memory over convenience. That debate never resolves because it's not academic, it's human. You choose what matters when resources tighten. Everyone does. You replay the journey backward in your mind. The gardens, the pounding stones, the sauces, the famine leaves, the voices trying to remember names. Nothing here was accidental. Nothing here was stupid. Loss doesn't require failure, it just requires change. A final light joke drifts in, because even endings deserve one. Somewhere, a vegetable that disappeared centuries ago would be thrilled to know it's now the subject of a very sleepy YouTube video. Legacy is weird like that. You feel something loosen. The urgency fades. The need to fix everything quiets. These vegetables don't need rescuing tonight. They need acknowledgement. You've given them that by listening. The air cools. The kitchen fire burns lower. Sounds stretch farther apart. You're no longer trying to remember details. You're letting impressions blur, the way they're supposed to at this hour. You remind yourself, gently, that forgetting is part of being human, but noticing is a choice. And tonight, you noticed. The world will keep simplifying. Crops will keep competing. Some plants will vanish. Others will return under new names, new sauces, new meanings. None of that needs to keep you awake. You settle into the rhythm of breath and fan hum. The soil darkens, the pots empty, The voices soften into murmurs that no longer ask anything of you. Let the images dissolve. Let the questions rest. Nothing needs deciding now. You did enough by staying. The pace slows further now, like footsteps fading down a long corridor. You don't need to hold on to any of this. The names, the arguments, the losses. They can drift past you without sticking. Think instead of warmth settling into the ground after a long day, of kitchens closing their doors, of hands finally at rest. Vegetables grow, vegetables disappear. And still, people eat, adapt, and continue. There's comfort in that continuity, even when parts of it go missing. Nothing here was wasted. Every leaf fed someone once. That's enough to let it sleep. Your body understands this rhythm better than your mind does. You feel it in the heaviness behind your eyes, in the way thoughts stretch and thin, losing their edges. Let them. The stories don't need endings. They only need quiet. Somewhere seeds lie dormant. Some will never wake. Some will, when conditions allow. You don't have to watch over them. Time does that on its own. The fan hums steadily now. The night has weight, but it's a comfortable weight, like a blanket you didn't realize you needed. Nothing presses, nothing demands attention. If a final image lingers, let it be simple. A pot cooling on a hearth, steam thinning into air, the smell of greens fading into earth. No urgency, no loss, just stillness. Sleep doesn't erase memory, it just softens it. Let that softness take you.